All right, everybody, welcome to another flipped classroom video. We're going to be looking at Foner 118 to 126. Here are the subject headings from chapter 4 in case you have a different edition. So we're largely centering around EQ number 3 here if you're prepping for your upcoming essay. So I have it posted at the bottom of some of these slides. So just keep that in the back of your mind as I walk our way through this reading. So the first thing we read about last night is voting in the colonies. It's important for us to understand ways in which voting rights expanded slightly from England, but also remain limited, especially based on socioeconomic status. So first off, there still were property qualifications in the colonies, right? Non-land owners typically were not able to vote, and this continued well into the 19th century until Andrew Jackson was president, so we'll get to that eventually. Now, voting rights are similar to that in Great Britain in that they were grounded in these Lockean principles of life, liberty, and property. The idea was that people who owned property had more of an economic stake in society than people who didn't. But an interesting counterpoint to this is that non-property owners, particularly indentured servants, enslaved people, they were the backbone of the workforce, and yet they had no voice in government at all, nor could they hold seats in any sort of elected assembly. So one could challenge the notion that the colonies truly had a representative government if the have-nots were not only not able to occupy those offices, but weren't able to select people to represent them. One thing, though, to point out with regard to the expansion of voting, still more people in the colonies were able to own property to begin with than they were in Great Britain. So voting rights did still expand in the colonies by comparison. It's just important for us to remember all the people that were still left out. So most notably, religious minorities. So essentially anyone who was not a Puritan in the North or anyone who wasn't an Anglican in the South. That includes Jews, Catholics, and also religious dissenters, people who dissented from Puritanism or Anglicanism, people like Roger Williams or Anne Hutchinson. Also goes without saying, all women were excluded, all Native Americans were excluded. There was a brief period in colonial history where free blacks had voting rights, but as the late 17th century came about, especially in the wake of Bacon's Rebellion, you saw that there were local measures passed to restrict the right to vote for all black persons living in the colonies. Let's talk about holding public office. So one thing that's important to delineate here is appointed versus elected positions. There was still a general trend in the early development of the colonies towards appointed positions. So in royal colonies, colonies like Virginia, the governor was directly appointed by the English crown. And so that's not really a representative institution at all. And he was still very much beholden to the interests of England rather than the colonies themselves. It's actually an interesting way to look back at Bacon's rebellion. If you think about why William Berkeley was so steadfastly opposed by Bacon and his followers, part of it was that they saw him looking out for the interests of the British crown more than the development of the colonies themselves. In proprietary colonies like Pennsylvania or Maryland, these were also still appointive proprietors of colonies. They were still typically friends of the king, right? So someone like William Penn was just given a major land grant, and they would still typically appoint the governors of the states. Another thing that limits democracy in terms of office holding was there was still a property qualification, of course. If there was a property qualification to vote, of course there was one to hold office. And typically, you had to own way more property to be able to be in an elected position than you would just to vote. In many states, you had to own at least 500 acres of land. And also, some colonies even required that office holders own slaves. So we could also consider how all of this, again, links to this third essential question about the reaches and limits of freedom and liberty in the colonies. I mean, if it's literally a requirement to own a person to represent your constituents, how free, really, overarchingly are these colonies? Another issue with this is this property qualification, the extended property qualification, further exacerbated the gap between the haves and have-nots of society, especially in the South with this very unequal plantation-structured economy. It essentially made it impossible for anyone but planters to hold office, but yet again, they were still meant to represent the interests of everyone. Let's move on to talk about how the colonies do start to develop some political autonomy, and this was all shaped around the era of salutary neglect. which was something that started relatively early into colonial development. Once the colonies started to become more stable and independent towards the end of the 17th century, the British Crown largely leaves the colonies to their own devices in terms of governing. The interactions between Britain and the colonies were primarily economic, so Britain still very much relied on the colonies for trade. They wanted to exploit the natural resources that came from the colonies. But when it came to governing, they largely just let the colonies develop their own systems of government. So you start to see the rise of more local assemblies. They gain more power and agency. Although, again, like I said in the previous slide, the governor, the leader of the actual colony at large, was still typically appointed. So it's interesting because the rise of assemblies, these more localized governments, were in a lot of ways a challenge to the governor's authority. And another big question to ask is, why did salutary neglect occur at all? Well, the crown was more interested in profiting off of the colonies, but they believed ultimately that legislation could be delegated to the local level. There just wasn't as much interest in terms of the legislative process to pass laws that pertain specifically to the colonies. But what's interesting is as the colonies start to grow, especially as their economies grow, their legislative decisions do start to shape economic policies. So they actually start to put the colonies in conflict with the agenda of the British Crown. A really good example that the book mentioned is that the colonies start to print their own paper currency, and British traders oppose that because to them it's just pieces of paper. And so when the colonies start to actually shape the economy, you're going to see a little bit more tension there. But ultimately, salutary neglect remains the status quo until 1763. That's the end of the French and Indian War, which we're going to talk about towards the end of this unit. Actually, we'll really talk about it in Unit 3. And then we'll start to better understand why salutary neglect ends and the British start to clamp down on their control over the colonies. So the colonies technically still use British ideals of government also, which is really interesting. They still believe in this idea of governing by consent. And sort of the irony there is that the colonies are almost using this idea, this Lockean idea that, one has to consent to be governed as a way to actually break free from British authority. Okay, let's move on and talk a little bit about political participation in the colonies. We already talked about this with voting a little bit, but how else did the public, especially if they couldn't vote, engage with the political process? So one thing that's really interesting is how public spaces became political forums. So the coffee house and tavern were sort of the American version of the Enlightenment salon. I'm not sure if you studied that in ninth grade or not, but they were local public spaces to discuss current affairs, policy, philosophies. Foner argues that they were more democratic and more accessible to a wider audience. Enlightenment salons were typically something that the intellectual elite occupied, and poor individuals did not really have access to these. Coffee houses and taverns were maybe slightly more accessible to a wider audience, but still, the ideas, the space that they occupied was still reserved for the educated populace. But one thing that's worth pointing out is that more people in the colonies were literate. But to say that it's a purely democratic institution to have political conversations in coffee houses and taverns is short-sighted. Moving forward, though, when we get closer to the revolution, it's going to be a really interesting hotspot. These coffee spots and taverns are hotbeds for activity to discuss potential revolutionary ideals. The press. So the press is an interesting element to talk about when we're thinking of freedom in the colonies. If we want to make the argument that the colonies are more free because of the press, we could argue accessibility. There were more printing presses in the English colonies than there were in any other European colony in the Americas. And also, the literacy rate in the English colonies was much higher than in other colonies, and also much higher than it was in Great Britain. Now, people were educated primarily for religious reasons, but still their ability to access all the different things that were available via printing press, whether they were political pamphlets, newspapers, farmers' almanacs, etc. It was easier to have access to information because it was more widely available. I just mentioned libraries and newspapers. They continue to proliferate throughout the 1700s. And again, moving forward, the circulation, the widespread circulation of all this printed material will have a major impact on the spread of revolutionary ideas moving forward. Because the colonies are pretty spread out, the ability to rapidly print this material is going to be a huge influencer in the spread of revolutionary ideals. It's important, though, to realize that access to all these ideas is not the same as free speech. So, when the English began to interpret the idea of free speech in the Lockean era, they were really only applying free speech to people who were elected to the legislature. Um, People who wrote news articles could still be potentially punished or jailed for sedition or libel. So if they disparaged an elected government official, they could actually go to prison for it. And the best example of this being tested was Peter Zenger's trial. He wrote pieces criticizing the governor of New York of corruption, and he was arrested for sedition, and he was put on trial. But he was ultimately acquitted, found not guilty. But still, some historians argue that just the fact that he was arrested for sedition could serve as a cautionary tale that writing against government officials could still lead to punishment. And so, this is an argument to say that the press was still limited in its freedoms. So, again, an interesting way to go about answering this third essential question if that's the essay you choose to write. Okay, final slide here. Let's talk about the spread of the Enlightenment to the colonies and also the introduction of the Great Awakening. So, again, in ninth grade, you probably studied the Enlightenment. So, in the Americas, as the colonies developed, the ideas from the Enlightenment spread out from overseas. But they simultaneously exist in tension with this new religious revival called the Great Awakening. So, we'll talk about the Enlightenment for a second, and then we'll switch over to the Great Awakening. So the most prominent Enlightenment philosophers in the American colonies were Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson, and their main Enlightenment principle that they shared with their European counterparts was that reason rather than religion should be the primary basis for governing society and making major decisions. Um, in terms of religion, they were not completely secular, but they identified with a religious faith called deism, which was actually quite popular at the time. So they did believe in God, one God, so it was Christian-esque, but they did not believe in divine intervention. So they essentially believed that God's role was to create the earth, but then after that completely withdrew from worldly affairs. And so divine intervention essentially is not a thing if you're a deist. You don't believe that God is suddenly going to change a situation if you pray, for example. So that sort of removal of God from the day to day was a major break from the more traditional religious sects in the colonies, such as the Puritans and Anglicans. So that's one of the reasons why the Great Awakening comes about, right? The Great Awakening took place simultaneously with the Enlightenment in the colonies, partially because there was a fear that the colonies were becoming more secular. And indeed they were. And it wasn't just because of the Enlightenment that the colonies were secularizing. One of the other reasons was that the colonies started to become increasingly focused on their economic development. And so it wasn't uncommon for someone to work on a Sunday, for example, which was seen as the traditional Christian day of rest. Right, and so the Great Awakening came about as a religious revival that was attempting to win back followers to the church. Like I said earlier, it was also definitely seen as a direct response to the Enlightenment because there was this fear that an emphasis on reason would, again, draw people away from the church. One of the interesting characteristics of the Great Awakening is that these really, really prominent preachers start to emerge almost as celebrities. Some of them actually travel around to different towns in the colonies and give these passionate speeches that attempt to draw large crowds and attract people to join the church. And some of these speeches also actually use fear to try to get people to rejoin the church. And I think the most prominent example of that would be Jonathan Edwards' speech, Sinners in the Hand of an Angry God. And this is an artistic rendering of him giving that speech. And I think we'll read that in class as a primary source. Essentially, what he is arguing when he gives this speech is that people who stray too far away from the church are going to burn in hell. And so that sort of fear-mongering was relatively successful. Still, there was certainly a fear of God in many of the colonists, and his audience was also he was trying to target the younger population in particular because it was a younger generation that was typically more secular than the older one. And so the result of the Great Awakening is that you do see some rejoin the church, but you also will see some new churches start to emerge as answers to maybe some of the more traditional elements of Puritanism and Anglicanism. So you're going to see many more evangelical sects start to emerge, especially in the colonial South, like Methodists and Baptists. So they actually believe more in a separation of church and state. At least then they did. And they do criticize some of the more theocratic governmental systems, like the Puritan structure in New England. Um, Also, they critique the fact that the church collected taxes. They believe that the church was profiting, and they may have been emphasizing that over salvation. And another thing that's interesting about the Great Awakening is some members of the Great Awakening also start to speak out against slavery as well. And the most notable group that does that are the Quakers, which were largely centered in Pennsylvania. And so I hope that this video gave you a little bit more detail from the reading, and I hope as you were watching, you were paying attention to this question, because if you choose this question to answer for our Unit 2 essay, you will have a lot of material to draw from this section, but certainly the sections previous to this, the ones that talked about slavery, the ones that talked about the development of religion in New England, the socioeconomic hierarchy that existed in the colonial South, all that stuff is great material for this essential question. But just really wanted to have this essential question be front and center as I talked about these slides. So thanks for listening. I hope this was helpful. Let me know if you have any questions. Take care.